Today we're taking a look at a ship that needs no introduction. It's of course the Galor Class cruiser. We recently looked at the Nebula class, and given that it appeared in the same episode as the Nebula, it's only really right that we should look at it now, especially given how prolific it's already been within battle space. So beginning with its out-of-universe explanation, it was designed by Rick Sternbach for The Wounded, and he really apparently took a lot of Egyptian cues which went into that shape, and it's interesting because a lot of people have since described it as a sort of insectoid looking. Equally, I've seen a lot of people describe it as quite aquatic looking, and the Cardassian ships look like manta rays. Make of that what you will. But there are two different versions of the Galor, as well as one redress. There's the original Galor model, that then gets redressed into the Keldon model, and then as well as that there's the Galor CGI model, which is a separate model, and actually is quite distinct in a number of ways. There are just a few small differences in proportions, but they do actually, when you look at the two ships side by side, they do actually come out as quite striking. In any case, in universe, it was developed really during the 2350s, during the Cardassian border wars with the Federation. They had already launched the Echor and Kulinor classes, and they like those two ships, but they are finding that really there's a big capability gap between the two of them, and that Starfleet's able to exploit this, and so the Central Command issues a requirement for what they describe as a universal cruiser. And that's quite important actually, because the whole universal cruiser idea is actually one that a lot of the powers had been playing with for some time. But the Cardassians were really the first to field a universal cruiser, and actually they knocked it out of the park pretty successfully. Its equivalents would be either the Vochar or the Nebula, both of which are universal cruisers, but the Vochar is more of an attack cruiser and universal as a warship, but beyond that has little utility other than a combat vessel. And the Nebula was really not that numerous to be an effective universal cruiser. Yes, it was similarly modular and versatile to the Galor, but it never saw as much widespread use as the Galor would. So in that respect, they really knocked it out of the park. As you can see, it actually has a lot in common with the Kulinor design, and it really is homogenizing the Kulinor and Echor together. You can see on the Kulinor, they start developing those shapes, and what they really do on the Galor is to develop those shapes further to create a more effective warp bubble. They're really following down the lineage of the Kulinor, which had the advantage in performance and warp speed, which is why they look so alike. It fills out pretty similar in terms of proportions to the Kulinor. A lot of its features can also be traced to the Echor, so an example of that would be the shuttle bays, which are in fact derived from the Echor, and actually similarly so the nacelle ram scoops are also derived from the Echor. So there's a lot of sharing going on between the designs, and both have a lot of input going into the Galor. And in terms of that, it was extremely successful. It debuted in 2360 and was quite impressive. It was equal, and in some respects superior, to the Excelsior class, which was really the benchmark the Cardassians had set all throughout the border war, and that was the really big turning point, that they now had a ship that could match the rank and file of Starfleet, and they could start producing it in significant numbers. This was a very highly produced ship. Now I'll get on to these modules. So one of the most famous modular variations is of course the Keldon, which is actually just an assault carrier variant. A lot of people think it's a separate class. That's not the case at all. There's barely any difference between them, apart from the fact that there's a big carrying cargo module and a few stabilizer fins, which you can actually see the mounting points for on the basic Galor, and those carry an additional 4 shuttle bays, and provide a little bit extra warp stability to compensate for the increased cross-section. But otherwise, a Keldon is a bog-standard Galor. And there are numerous other variations of Galor that exist, although we don't really see many, but it's very effective, and it would see a huge number of subvariants likely. So that then brings us on to the numerous upgrades and marks of Galor that exist, which is really quite complicated. Most other ships have had comparatively short runs or single model long runs. The Galor has a lot of reasonably short run subvariants, but they run into each other a lot. So the first subvariant is obviously the Mark 1. Now the Mark 1 can be distinguished by its blue deflector dish, and they were there at the tail end of the Cardassian border wars. But by the 2360s, they had been phased out. Originally, they were planning to phase them out with the Mark II. Now, the Mark II, we see the Wounded and Ensign row. They can be distinguished by their orange-yellow deflector dish. Now, the Mark II is quite an interesting vessel. It housed a whole new computer system, as well as a lot of exotic particle weapons. It was really quite unique. It was also incredibly expensive to produce, and they soon realised that it would not be viable on large scale, so it was only issued to the Guard's order, and that then led to the development of the Mark III, which is distinguishable by its red deflector dish, and that's what we'll see throughout most of the rest of the 2360s and 70s. Now there was also then a Mark IV, and the Mark IV comes in after the Cardassians joined the Dominion, and is just a slightly modified Mark III, effectively, but modified with Dominion components, bringing it up to an even higher standard, so that by the time we get to the Mark IV, it's actually still staying relatively on par, or even again in some respects superior to the Dominion War Excelsior class. So in that respect, it proved its ability as an extremely versatile modular ship than it was always the intention when they designed it to be a long-term vessel, something that would see use over decades. Really, the Kulanor and Ekor had been stopgaps to close the distance between them and to close the distance in terms of technical capabilities, but the Galor really was able to keep up with technological advancements and incorporate them into its design. So it was a very forward-thinking design in that respect. In terms of tactical systems, it's very well armed. It includes one heavy disruptor in the front deflector dish, and you have the effects guys to thank for that. You then have a total of 16 disruptors, which are dotted around the ship. If you look at some of the CG models, you can actually see the mounting point. They're these little white spots that you can see all around the hull, giving it a sort of all-round arc of fire, which makes sense. While always having a strong forward arc is important, so while it does have the primary heavy disruptor on the front arc, it's certainly not outgunned from the side or even rear. It's a very capable ship, and is not an easy target no matter what attack vector you adopt. In terms of performance, as I said previously, it's a homogenization of the Ekor and Kulanor, and it really outperforms both of them. It's not quite as nimble at impulse as the Kulanor, but would go on to in fact exceed it in warp speed performance, and again with further upgrades, even by the Galor Mark II, they were outgunning the Ekor. So in that respect, it was a very effective follow-on, and really bridged the gap and became what the Cardassians wanted from it, which was to become a universal workhorse, and a very effective one at that. Like I say, this is the first real universal cruiser that would see service, and frankly, it's the first one, and frankly, it's the only one to really fully knock it out of the park. Even if it is inferior to a lot of other ships of the time, what it has going for it is its modularity, how easy it is to produce, and how easy it is to upgrade. This is a very effective platform that not only would see the Cardassians through the 2360s, but also the Dominion War, and would continue to actually see service even afterwards. So in that respect, it's actually a very effective ship and lived up to its intention of being a multi-decade or even multi-generational design that was able to stay in service and stay really quite competitive. And it's actually done a very good job of really rivaling the Excelsior in that respect, which is a very respected lineage. So it's actually very successful, given that it's been able to match its main adversary, which was of course what they were dealing with. And it was a very grounded philosophy that really brought the ship about and really produced a very utilitarian and effective design that really has outlived a lot of its contemporaries and competitors. And as I say, post-war, it still sees use in the Cardassian Union, and can even be seen as one of the main as a export as well, actually. So it's a very successful design, and really quite a impressive achievement for what many regard to be a bit of an underdog power.